Some words conjure up pretty much exactly the same image, regardless of who you are. When someone says Vikings, your brain probably pictures towering, brutal warriors pillaging their way through the civilized world, horned helmets dripping with blood and gore, and ships cutting through icy waters. Savage barbarians, brutal raiders, chaos on legs. But here's the thing, almost everything that you've been told about them is either a wild exaggeration or just plain wrong. And it's not just movies or TV shows that tell us these tales. Archaeologists, even so-called experts, have made their fair share of mistakes about the Vikings. Turns out that unearthing the truth isn't always as simple as digging up a sword or a rusty helmet. So, what have we got wrong? Were they really marauding savages? Did they really wear those iconic horned helmets? And how did archaeology itself help build and later dismantle some of these myths? Alright, let's start with the star of the show, the horned helmet. It's practically the Viking mascot at this point. Big, intimidating, totally impractical, but instantly recognizable. However, no Viking ever actually wore one of these things in battle. So, where did this whole horned helmet thing come from? Well, we can blame an opera. Back in the 1800s, a costume designer was working on Wagner's Ring Cycle, and he decided to slap some horns on the Viking helmet to make them look extra dramatic. It worked. Audiences loved it, and like all good lies, it stuck around. For decades, even some archaeologists just ran with it. After all, it fit the popular image of the Vikings as these savage, untamed beasts. As is often the case, the truth is less exciting. The helmets archaeologists have found from the Viking Age, they're pretty standard, pretty boring. No horns, just simple, rounded headgear made for one purpose, keeping your skull intact when you're in a fight. Functional, not flashy. The only actual horned helmets ever discovered were thousands of years older than the Viking Age and probably belonged to Bronze Age people who used them for ceremonies, not for combat. And yet, despite all of the evidence, the myth persists. Let's face it, skincare, not my area of expertise, but when you spend as much time looking at a camera and then looking at yourself on a camera, I'm right there, you start noticing things like my rapid descent into middle age. Enter FOREO Sweden. Now, you've probably heard me mention their UFO 3, the Lunar 4, the Bear, and the FAQ 202 device in the past, and yes, I've been using them for a while now, long enough to know that they actually make a difference. Before FOREO, I'm going to put these down, my idea of skincare was pretty much soap and then maybe some moisturizer if I remembered, but now the UFO 3, that's this one, warming facial masks that hydrate deeply in just 2 minutes. The Bear, this is one that I use absolutely every day. I brush my teeth, I shave my head, and then I use this thing. It's a microcurrent toning device that gives your face a gentle workout. No gym membership requires, removes those fine lines and all of that good stuff. There's Lunar 4, go-to for cleansing and firming massage, and of course the FAQ 202 light mask, which brings LED treatments right to your living room. And here's the thing, FOREO's products rarely on sale, but right now is their biggest sale of the year, up to 50% off plus an extra 10% off if you use my code 10SIDEP. So if you're thinking about stepping up your skincare game or just need an amazing gift idea, now's the time. Thanks to FOREO for sponsoring, click the link below, and now back to today's video. Okay, let's tackle another big myth, the idea that Vikings were just savage, bloodthirsty raiders. It's a popular image, and sure, there's some truth to it. They did raid, they did pillage. They showed up in their longships, wreaked havoc on monasteries and settlements, and sailed off with physical and sometimes human treasure. But reducing the Vikings to just marauders is like calling an artist a house painter. It isn't the whole picture. Archaeology has revealed that Vikings were far more than raiders. They were builders, traders, explorers, and farmers. They were among the most skilled seafarers of their time, using advanced shipbuilding techniques. They could construct longships capable of crossing open seas and navigating shallow rivers. Their voyages took them far beyond Scandinavia, reaching as far as North America centuries before Columbus, with Leif Erikson landing in Vinland, which is modern Newfoundland. They also explored the Arctic, the British Isles, Eastern Europe, establishing trade routes and settlements along the way. Their extensive trading network connected the East and the West. They traded goods such as furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves in exchange for silver, silk, spices, and other exotic items from Byzantium, the Islamic Caliphate, and Asia. Key trading hubs like Hedeby and Burqa became bustling centers centers of commerce. Their economic activities played a crucial role in early medieval European economies. Evidence of their products has been found from Newfoundland to the west and Uzbekistan in the east. The Viking Age saw the early development of forms of governance. The Thing, a community assembly, served as a legislative and judicial body, allowing free men to discuss laws, settle disputes, and make collective decisions. This democratic tradition reflected a society that valued consensus and collective decision-making. Norse governance influenced legal systems in regions where the Vikings settled, such as Danelaw in England and parts of Ireland. Vikings were not only warriors, but also poets, storytellers, and artisans. Their rich oral tradition preserved Norse myths and sagas that would later be written down, forming the foundation of much of our understanding of Norse culture and mythology. Stories of gods like Odin, Thor, and Loki reveal their deep spirituality and cultural values. Their artistry was equally remarkable. They excelled in metalwork, wood carving, and ship decoration. The intricate designs of brooches, weapons, and runestones show a keen eye for detail and an appreciation for beauty. Viking women weren't just sitting at home, weaving tapestries or watching the kids, as was the case for most parts of the world back then. Who would have thought that this barbaric group was at the cutting edge of the feminist movement over 1,000 years before the suffragettes? For a long time, the role of Viking women was thought to be a traditional feminine one, but that changed with the discovery of the Burka warrior. Back in the late 1800s, archaeologists uncovered a Viking grave filled with weapons, swords, axes, even armor, and naturally assumed that it belonged to a male warrior. For over a century, no one questioned that. A grave packed with weapons, there clearly had to be a dude. Then in 2017, someone decided to test the DNA of the bones, and surprise, surprise, it was actually a woman. This wasn't some fluke either. Evidence now suggests that Viking women may have held far more power and influence than previously thought. Some even fought in battle. Others managed estates, traded goods, and wielded authority in ways that would have been unthinkable in many other medieval societies. The discovery didn't just challenge the stereotype of Viking women, it forced archaeologists to rethink their entire approach to Viking burials. How many other graves have been wrongly labeled? How many more women might have been overlooked because of outdated assumptions? So the next time you picture a hulking male swinging an axe into a terrified monk in Britain, don't let your sexist assumptions get the better of you. It might well have been a hulking female dispatching the quivering monk. If you've ever seen a dramatic Viking funeral on TV, you probably picture a flaming ship drifting across the horizon, carrying a fallen warrior to Valhalla. It's a great visual, but while those ship burials did happen, they were far from the norm. Archaeologists once thought most Vikings were buried with their boats, weapons, and treasures. After all, that's what the big, flashy graves showed. But those elaborate burials were for the elite, the chieftains, the wealthy, or anyone with serious clout. Most Viking burials were a lot humbler. Some were cremated, some were buried in simple pits, and others just didn't leave much trace at all. Viking religion also wasn't as cut and dry as it's often portrayed to be. We know all about Odin, Thor, and Valhalla, but the Vikings were surprisingly open-minded regarding faith. As they traded and raided across Europe, they encountered Christianity, Islam, and other religions, and they weren't above borrowing ideas. In fact, some Viking graves contain a mix of pagan and Christian symbols, showing how these cultures influenced each other. Here's a stereotype you've probably heard. Vikings were dirty, smelly barbarians. It makes sense. They were rough, rugged seafarers, too busy raiding monasteries to bother with baths or brushing their hair. But once again, the evidence tells a different story. It turns out that Vikings were some of the cleanest people of their time. Archaeological digs have uncovered an impressive number of grooming tools, including combs, razors, tweezers, and even ear cleaners. They took personal hygiene really rather seriously. Their cleanliness was so noticeable that other cultures wrote about it. English monks, for instance, complained that Vikings bathed too often, once a week. That might sound outrageous to our cleanliness-obsessed minds, but weekly baths were practically unheard of back then. And grooming wasn't just about cleanliness, it also played a role in Viking social life. Looking good and smelling decent helped with everything from trading deals to courtship. Imagine negotiating over silk or spices when you stink to high heaven. It's not exactly ideal. One of the biggest misconceptions about Viking history is that they were a unified, monolithic group. When we think of Vikings, we often imagine them as one cohesive people, raiding, trading, and conquering in perfect harmony, but the reality was far more diverse. The term Viking itself doesn't refer to a single nationality or even a distinct ethnic group. Instead, it's a term used to describe activities, raiding, exploring, trading, typically carried out by people from Scandinavia. This vast region included modern-day Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, but each area had its unique identity, culture, and priorities. Archaeological evidence shows significant regional differences in how they lived, traveled, and interacted with the world. In Denmark, the focus was often on agricultural settlements and proximity to European trade routes. Danish Vikings were the first to raid England and later established the Danelaw, a region in England governed by Norse law. Meanwhile, Norwegians were pioneering explorers. They journeyed to the British Isles, Ireland, and even across the Atlantic, discovering Greenland and Vinland in North America. On the other hand, Swedish and Finnish Vikings looked east, traveling through Russian rivers and establishing trade routes to Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates. They were more inclined toward commerce than conquest, creating bustling trade hubs along their routes. These differences extended to their religious practices, their art, and even how they built their ships. While all Vikings shared a maritime culture, their ship designs varied. Norwegian longships designed for open ocean travel differed from Swedish vessels that were better suited for river navigation. The diversity didn't stop at geography. The Viking Age spanned roughly 300 years, and during that time, their society evolved dramatically. Early Viking raids gave way to settlements, trade, and even diplomacy. As we mentioned, some Vikings became Christian, blending their Norse traditions with new beliefs, while others remained staunchly pagan. This patchwork of cultures completely challenges the stereotypical image of the Viking warrior. Instead, it paints a picture of a dynamic and adaptable people, constantly evolving and responding to the world around them. The narrative of the Vikings as unstoppable raiders and conquerors dominates their legend. For centuries, they terrorized Europe, plundering monasteries, seizing territory, and establishing dominance wherever they went. But what many don't realize, or what is often oversimplified, is that the Vikings were not invincible. They were eventually beaten. But the story of their decline is far more complex than just losing battles. One of the key misconceptions is that the Vikings simply faded into history after a decisive military defeat. In truth, their decline was a gradual process influenced by changing political, military, and cultural landscapes. The end of the Viking Age, often marked around 1066 with the defeat of King Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, was not just the result of a single loss, but a culmination of pressures that limited their once dominant position. Over time, European kingdoms adapted to the Viking threat. Initially caught off guard by their fast-moving raids, coastal communities and rulers developed more substantial fortifications and organized naval defenses. Leaders like King Alfred the Great in England resisted Viking incursions and formed strategies to reclaim land and establish long-term stability. Alfred's victory over the Vikings at the Battle of Edington in 878 was a turning point, forcing them to settle and assimilate in parts of England under the Danelaw Agreement. Additionally, the rise of centralized monarchies and the unification of territories in Scandinavia weakened the Viking way of life. As Norway, Denmark, and Sweden consolidated under single rulers, the traditional decentralized raiding culture gave way to structured kingdoms focused on internal governance and Christianity. These rulers curtailed the chaotic independence that fueled Viking raids. Religion also played a significant role. The Christianization of Scandinavia during the 10th and 11th centuries fundamentally altered Viking society. As leaders and the populations converted to Christianity, the culture and ideological motivations for raiding diminished. Christian Scandinavians began integrating into the broader European sphere rather than standing apart as a distinct and often antagonistic force. While the Vikings' military dominance waned, their influence endured through their settlements, trade routes, and cultural legacies. So while they were eventually beaten in battle and their era ended, their imprint on history remained significant, reminding us that their defeat wasn't the end of the story, it was simply the next chapter. The Vikings, long shrouded in myths and misrepresentations, have been misunderstood for centuries. Often depicted as ruthless raiders in horned helmets, this image only scratches the surface of a complex and multifaceted society. Their reputation as bloodthirsty warriors overshadowed their achievements as explorers, traders, settlers, and innovators. But why have these inaccuracies persisted? The earliest records about the Vikings came from those they raided, monks and clergy of medieval Europe. These sources, understandably biased, painted the Norse people as godless savages who destroyed sacred sites. Such accounts, steeped in fear and condemnation, became the foundation for much of their historical portrayal. Over time, the Viking narrative became a tool for propaganda, used to depict them as the other, in contrast to the supposedly civilized societies they invaded. Popular culture further distorted the Vikings' image in the modern era, from 19th century romanticism, which emphasized their barbaric traits, to modern television shows that focus on their raiding exploits. The nuanced reality of the Vikings is often sacrificed for dramatic storytelling. Archaeological interpretations also contributed, as early excavations focused on weapons and warships, reinforcing the idea of the Vikings as primarily warriors. Yet, evidence increasingly reveals a different story. Viking settlements were vibrant centers of culture and trade, and their democratic assemblies and advanced shipbuilding showcased their ingenuity. They were global citizens of their time, connecting parts of the world through trade routes that stretched from North America to Central Asia. Women in Viking society had significant roles, from leadership to combat, challenging the patriarchal stereotypes of the past. Now, the Vikings certainly did their fair share of pillaging, particularly across Western Europe, but the evidence is now clear and undeniable. They were much more than just that.